A bomb so massive it had to be carried in pairs, one in each wing of a stealth bomber that flew for 18 hours straight just to deliver it, was built for exactly one purpose: to destroy a single nuclear facility buried so deep inside an Iranian mountain that no other weapon on Earth stood a real chance of reaching it. 14 months after it was actually used in combat for the first time, the question of whether it actually worked is still genuinely disputed, and the answer depends entirely on who you ask. Let me walk you through the full story of this weapon, exactly what it did when it finally got used, and why even now, over a year later, experts still disagree about what's actually left underneath that mountain. Here's where this weapon actually came from. The GBU-57, officially called the Massive Ordnance Penetrator, traces its origins back to a program the Air Force started in 2002, nicknamed Big Blue. That program actually got paused early on due to funding problems and technical difficulties, but it got revived after battle damage assessments from the 2003 invasion of Iraq revealed something genuinely alarming. Existing American bunker-busting bombs simply weren't powerful enough to destroy certain heavily fortified underground targets. In 2004, the military formally established a requirement for an entirely new class of weapon: a heavy, precision-guided munition specifically built to strike deeply buried facilities that nothing else in the American arsenal could touch. Testing began in 2007, using rocket sleds and actual aircraft drops, eventually leading to full integration onto the B-2 Spirit stealth bomber. The Air Force officially began receiving these bombs in 2011. Now let's talk about the actual specifications of this weapon, because the engineering behind it is genuinely staggering once you understand what it's built to do. The GBU-57 weighs in at 30,964 pounds, essentially 14,000 kilograms, including a warhead alone that weighs over 5,000 pounds. It measures 20.5 feet long. Its casing is built from a specialized high-density steel alloy, specifically engineered to survive the violent physical impact of punching through solid rock and reinforced concrete without the bomb itself breaking apart before it can actually detonate where it's supposed to. According to the Air Force's own official description, the weapon is designed with a large explosive payload, while maintaining the structural integrity of the penetrator casing during impact. Depending on the specific source you look at, the GBU-57 can punch through up to 200 feet of reinforced concrete or 60 feet of unreinforced concrete before ever detonating, and the kinetic impact alone delivers somewhere between 800 and 900 megajoules of pure force before the actual explosive warhead even goes off. Here's the detail that really tells you how specifically this bomb was engineered for one exact job. According to defense officials speaking to the War Zone, the strikes on Fordow were 15 years in the making, with that specific target being the primary driver behind the entire weapon's development and evolution from the very beginning. 15 years. This wasn't a general-purpose bomb that happened to get used on a convenient target. Fordow, a uranium enrichment facility buried somewhere between 80 and 90 meters underneath a mountain near the Iranian city of Qom, roughly 160 kilometers south of Tehran, was the specific reason this weapon existed at all. American intelligence analysts had identified this exact facility as a threat more than a decade before it was ever actually struck, and engineers spent 15 years building, testing, and refining a weapon capable of reaching it. So let's get into exactly what happened when this bomb finally got used, on June 22nd, 2025, during an operation the Pentagon named Midnight Hammer. 7 B-2 Spirit stealth bombers, each one carrying 2 of these 30,000-pound bombs, flew directly toward Iran, marking the very first time the GBU-57 had ever been used in actual combat, more than 2 decades after the weapon was first conceived. According to General Dan Kane, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, 12 of these bombs were dropped specifically on 2 separate ventilation shafts at Fordow. 6 bombs down each shaft, with the first 2 bombs at each location specifically used to blast through the concrete covering the shaft openings, followed by 5 more bombs sent down each of those exact same openings afterward. 2 additional bombs were used against the Natanz nuclear facility separately. That's 14 total GBU-57 bombs dropped in a single mission, alongside more than 30 Tomahawk cruise missiles launched from a submarine specifically targeting Iran's Isfahan nuclear complex, a facility buried too deep even for the Massive Ordnance Penetrator to reliably reach. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth's public assessment right after the strikes was about as confident and definitive as language gets, describing the operation as having completely obliterated Iran's nuclear capabilities. President Trump used identical language, calling the strikes a spectacular military success. That's the story that dominated headlines in the immediate aftermath. And if that was the entire picture, this would be a fairly simple, satisfying story with a clean, decisive ending. But here's where things get genuinely more complicated, and honestly, a lot more interesting. The Pentagon office responsible for actually developing the GBU-57 in the first place didn't share that same immediate total confidence, at least not publicly. According to detailed reporting from the War Zone, the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, The exact agency that spent years testing, modeling, and simulating this weapon in partnership with the Air Force before it was ever used was still waiting for comprehensive battle damage assessments weeks after the strikes had already happened, specifically to determine how well the weapon had actually performed in real combat conditions. Think about what that timeline gap actually tells you. The political leadership was already declaring total success within days. The actual scientists and engineers responsible for building and understanding this weapon were still waiting weeks later for the detailed data needed to confirm whether that declared success genuinely matched reality. And here's where the disagreement really starts to show itself. Israeli intelligence sources, according to multiple reports, offered a notably more cautious private assessment than the American public statements, suggesting the actual level of destruction at Fordow specifically may have been less severe than officially claimed, raising real concern that Iran's nuclear program might have only been set back by months, rather than the years that phrases like completely obliterated would naturally seem to imply. Satellite imagery analysis added yet another layer to this picture. General Kane himself offered a genuinely careful, technical explanation of exactly how this weapon actually works when it strikes an underground target, one that's worth understanding in detail because it directly explains why assessing the damage from the outside is so difficult in the first place. He told reporters that the majority of the damage they assessed, based on extensive modeling, came from what he called a blast layer, combined with the impulse extending outward from the initial shock of impact. In other words, the primary damage mechanism isn't necessarily a single massive fireball visible from space. It's often a violent pressure wave traveling through solid rock and reinforced concrete, an effect that can be devastating to equipment and infrastructure deep underground, while leaving comparatively modest, easily visible surface damage directly above the impact point. That's genuinely important context, because it means the absence of a dramatic, visible crater doesn't necessarily prove the underground facility survived intact. But it also means outside analysts, relying primarily on satellite photos of the surface, are working with a fundamentally incomplete picture when trying to assess what actually happened far below ground. David Albright, a former weapons inspector who now heads the Institute for Science and International Security, has been one of the most closely watched independent voices, trying to piece together exactly what happened underneath that mountain, using whatever evidence has actually been available. In the days immediately following the strike, he analyzed satellite images showing what he described as the Iranians actively working at the two Imapi impact sites, penetrating directly into the ventilation shafts themselves. He noted that this specific activity could involve several different things: backfilling the craters left behind, assessing the structural damage from the inside, or performing radiological testing to check for contamination. That kind of activity alone tells you something important. Whatever actually happened underground was serious enough that Iran felt compelled to send people directly into those exact shafts almost immediately afterward, rather than simply walking away from a site they considered a total, hopeless loss. Months later, after conducting a much more detailed analysis alongside a team of researchers studying data collected by the International Atomic Energy Agency, Albright's team reached a conclusion that genuinely threads the needle between the two competing narratives we've discussed here. They found that following the strikes, Iran no longer had any viable path to actually produce weapons-grade uranium at any of its known centrifuge facilities, for the first time in 15 years. That's a genuinely significant, meaningful finding. But notice exactly what it doesn't claim. It doesn't say Iran's entire nuclear program was permanently, irreversibly destroyed forever. It says the specific, immediate pathway to weapons-grade material through known facilities had been cut off, at least temporarily, a conclusion that sits somewhere between Hegseth's confident obliterated and the more skeptical Israeli assessments, suggesting only a months-long delay. There's also been at least one detailed independent technical analysis circulating that raises even sharper questions about exactly how deep the actual physical damage really went. That analysis specifically examined the post-strike imagery around Fordow's access points, pointing to heavy machinery actively cutting trenches and clearing material near the north entrance, and specifically noting that the fresh discoloration visible around the twin exhaust shafts appeared consistent with crushed dolomite and limestone powder, rather than vitrified rock, meaning rock that's been melted and fused together by truly extreme heat. That distinction actually matters quite a bit, technically, because if the surrounding rock shows signs of being crushed rather than vitrified, it could suggest the most intense heat and pressure from the blast may not have fully reached all the way into the deepest cascade halls where the actual centrifuges were housed. It's worth being upfront that this specific analysis comes from an independent commentator rather than an official government or IAEA assessment, and like any single analysis working from limited satellite imagery rather than direct on-site inspection, it represents one interpretation rather than a definitively confirmed fact. But it's a genuinely useful example of exactly why this entire question remains so contested well over a year later. Serious, technically literate people working from the same publicly available satellite images keep arriving at meaningfully different conclusions about what actually happened underneath that mountain. Making this entire assessment problem significantly harder to resolve with any real confidence, Iran has barred IAEA inspectors from accessing any of the struck sites ever since the attack happened. Think about what that actually means for anyone trying to determine the real truth here. The one organization with the technical expertise, the specialized equipment, and the legal mandate to actually go inside these facilities and definitively confirm what survived and what didn't has been completely locked out since the strikes occurred. Everyone else, the Pentagon, Israeli intelligence, independent researchers like David Albright, commentators analyzing satellite photos, are all working from indirect evidence, modeling, and inference, precisely because the one source of truly authoritative, on-the-ground confirmation has never actually been allowed back inside. As of May 2026, roughly 11 months after the original strikes, detailed tracking of Iran's nuclear program showed something genuinely important for understanding where this story actually stands today. Iran had accumulated approximately 400 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60% purity before Operation Midnight Hammer ever happened. That material, if further enriched up to 90%, would be sufficient to build several actual nuclear weapons. And here's the detail that should genuinely concern you, regardless of which damage assessment you find most convincing. The current location of that specific 400 kilogram stockpile remains unverified by the IAEA, precisely because Iran hasn't allowed inspectors back in to actually check. Whether that material survived the strikes intact somewhere deep underground, whether it was destroyed, or whether it was moved to some entirely different, undisclosed location before the bombs ever fell, is a question nobody outside Iran's own government can currently answer with genuine confidence. That same detailed tracking through May 2026 also confirms something we've touched on in other stories, that Iran has been actively rebuilding since the strikes, constructing new roofs over damaged structures at Isfahan, backfilling some tunnels while reinforcing others, and continuing construction at a previously secret third enrichment site near Natanz that analysts have nicknamed Pickaxe Mountain. Whatever the actual precise level of damage really was, at Fordow specifically, Iran's broader nuclear infrastructure clearly wasn't reduced to complete rubble with nothing left to salvage or rebuild around. The Pentagon itself has been remarkably candid about the fact that this entire damage assessment process is still actively ongoing, even well over a year later, and that the lessons learned are actively shaping the future of this exact weapon system. According to reporting from Defense Scoop, the Defense Threat Reduction Agency has been using the detailed battle damage assessment data specifically to improve future MOP designs and to help engineer an entirely new successor weapon, sometimes referred to as the NGP, or Next Generation Penetrator, specifically designed to reach even deeper, even more hardened targets than the current GBU-57 can reliably handle. When reporters specifically asked whether the MOP could reach other critical facilities built by adversaries like China, potentially even ones buried deeper than Fordow, a senior defense official declined to give specifics, saying only that the capabilities of the GBU-57 are constantly being analyzed for relevant operating environments, without discussing specifics beyond what had already been made public. And, in a detail that genuinely tells you the Pentagon isn't done with this weapon by any stretch, documents made public in February of 2026 revealed the Air Force was finalizing a $100 million deal with Boeing, specifically to restock its supply of GBU-57 bombs, ensuring the arsenal used on Fordow gets replenished for whatever might come next. That restocking decision came right as fresh tensions with Iran were building once again, with the Pentagon separately ordering an aircraft carrier to redeploy from the Caribbean directly to the Middle East. A clear signal that whatever this weapon actually accomplished at Fordow, American planners clearly believe they may need to use it again. So, did this 30,000-pound bomb, 15 years in development, built for exactly one specific mountain, actually destroy its intended target? The honest answer, based on everything we've walked through together, is that nobody outside a very small circle with access to classified intelligence, and quite possibly not even they, can currently give you a fully confirmed definitive answer. What we do know is that Iran's own president deflected direct questions about the damage by insisting only physical IAEA inspection could truly settle the matter, then turned around and refused to allow that exact inspection to happen. We know independent nuclear experts concluded Iran lost its viable path to weapons-grade uranium through known facilities for the first time in 15 years, a genuinely significant outcome, even if it stops well short of the total, permanent destruction officially claimed in the days right after the strike. We know Iran was observed actively working inside the exact craters and shafts these bombs created within days of the attack, suggesting whatever happened down there mattered enough to warrant an urgent hands-on response. And we know the Pentagon itself is still restocking this exact weapon and actively developing its successor, a strong signal that even the people who built it understand this specific fight over what's buried under that mountain, And what it will take to reach it, if it ever needs reaching again, is far from actually over. If this breakdown of exactly how disputed the single strike still remains, well over a year later, genuinely surprised you, drop a comment below and let me know which specific assessment you find most convincing, because honestly, when you see how much even experts working from the same satellite images disagree with each other, it becomes a lot easier to understand why this question still hasn't been fully settled. And if you made it all the way through this one with me, share it with someone who still thinks this story ended the moment those bombs were dropped. Because as we've just walked through together, the real question of what actually survived underneath that mountain is still being fought over today, using satellite photos, IAEA reports, and competing intelligence assessments, more than a year after the bombs themselves already fell. We'll keep tracking exactly what new evidence emerges about this specific strike. So stick around, because based on everything we've covered, this story is genuinely far from finished.